everyone, I'm Penn from thecreativepenn.com and this is Orna Ross. Welcome, Orna.
Hi Joe, hi everybody.
And we're here in St James's Park in London and we're doing a little interview today with Orna about her books and her opinion on indie authors. Orna, tell us a bit more about you and your publishing and writing backgrounds.
Okay, well I've been writing for 20 years and I started writing fiction at the beginning of the noughties. And I wrote two quite long novels, and it took me quite a bit of time to sell them to a publisher, but eventually they were picked up by Penguin, which was fabulous, 2-book deal, and I was really delighted about that. And like very many writers, I think I thought that was the end of a very long journey, and what I didn't realise was it was only the beginning of a very long journey. And in many ways it was a very interesting experience and I really enjoyed it, but in some ways it wasn't that positive, and I feel that a lot has happened to the book business in the last 15 years which isn't very good for authors like me particularly. Some authors do very well, some thrive, and then others a lot. I suppose the big sort of massive mid-list authors have not been doing so well in the last while in traditional publishing, which is why a lot of us are now turning to indie publishing, and that's what I'm doing. I have taken my rights back from Penguin and I'm going to publish the books myself. The main reason I'm doing this is I was quite shocked when I entered the publishing world and found that authors don't actually get the choice of title for their own book. They have absolutely no input into what the cover looks like, and various, essentially creative control is removed from you at that point. And that was quite shocking to me, and what was most shocking to me is that it was given to the supermarkets, Tesco's, Rudes, the book business now, and I had no idea about this. I mean, it's not like I was a shrinking violet or a wilting flower. I had worked in journalism. I was used to, writing and the publishing world, but nothing actually prepared me for the fiction publishing world at all. And I found it really quite cynical and very much about chasing bottom line, very much about chasing the next big thing. In the old days, what publishers did was they took a writer at the beginning of their career and invested in potential. Essentially, they worked with you through your first book, through your second book, and really they didn't begin to make a profit out of you until maybe your third or fourth book, and they worked with you to kind of build you to that place. By the time I entered publishing, it had all turned around, and essentially authors or publishing houses were looking for a new face, the new author, and you were only as good as your last book. So if your book didn't sell well, straight out, your publishing career was over. And essentially you had a 2-week window for it to succeed, because that's how much time you got in the press, in the marketing campaign, and then publishers went next, and you either had succeeded or failed. Now actually I succeeded, I was lucky. Tesco's did pick up my book. It did become a number 2 bestseller, which was fantastic. But I never felt that it reached the readers I wanted it to reach. I felt that people who bought it in Tesco's, who were lured in by the kind of cover it had, the title it had, were probably actually a bit disappointed with the book, and that those who might have really enjoyed it would never have bought a book with that cover and with that treatment. So for me, it's so exciting and so fantastic that now I can actually, I find out, am I right or am I completely wrong? I can put the book out there with my title, the original title that I wanted it to have, my choice of the cover, and I can go about reaching the kind of readers that I feel really will enjoy it.
Okay, so we've heard a bit about how it used to be, so what are you up to now with your independent publishing?
Well, I approached it in a slightly strange way. I began with a meditation book, and the reason I began with that was because essentially I felt it wasn't ever really going to sell to a mass audience, and so I felt I wanted to put it out there before I got started, almost, as it were. So that's there, and I learned and I practiced on that, and I offer it now as so it's freely available on the website for my blog subscribers. And then I wanted to learn how to format for Kindle and all the new various electronic formats. So I did a poetry book because that's very short, and practice on that. But now essentially I feel I'm kicking off really, what I what I really want to do. And the book that was Lover's Hollow for Penguin is about to go into formatting. It's now called After the Rising, and it is a book, essentially the book arose because I grew up in Ireland in a very small village in the 1960s, and that was about 50 to 60 years after the Irish liberation struggle, where Ireland got its freedom from the British Empire, essentially. But what I was interested in was not so much that as what happened afterwards. After that, there was a civil war in Ireland where the two sides fell out. The people who thought the treaty was a good thing and the people who thought the treaty was a bad thing. It's very common post-liberation, that sort of thing happens, but it's also very, very painful. And it was a very small village that I lived in, and essentially half the village didn't really talk to the other half. And my father's uncle had been shot in that war, and the story was that he was shot by his best friend, and I went to try and find out more about that, and I simply couldn't. It was a sort of a saying in Ireland, the less said the better, essentially, about everything. And
don't mention the war.
Don't mention, there wasn't even a war. The history book skipped completely. We had our glorious liberation struggle in 1916, we got our treaty, and then we jumped to 1932 and the Eucharistic Congress. The 1920s just didn't happen, as far as, and that is the truth in our history books in school. It absolutely was a blank page. Nobody went there. And of course, for a writer, or even for just a nosy person, that sort of thing just sucks you in. So I wanted to know more. I never was able to find more. I asked my father about it. He hadn't been told anything at all. So I ended up making up this huge big story of 3 generations, which had that kernel at the heart of it, and which is very much about exploring silence, what we talk about and what we don't talk about, and which is also about exploring liberation. What happens after the rising, after that moment of revolution, when you break out, and resolution needs to happen. How does it come about, and how we're not very good at that as human beings, really, in general. And so the book is told through the perspective of a woman called Jo Devereux, as we call it in Wexford, but Devereux, as you probably know it. And she grows up in a village not unlike the one that I grew up in, but quite different in other ways. And she has to leave her village because of this kind of tension that's there. It ruins a sort of Romeo and Juliet love affair that she's having, very intense, passionate love affair that she's having with somebody who's on the other side of the divide, and she doesn't understand why it happens. And her solution to her problem, as for so many Irish people, is to leave. It's to go. And she goes to San Francisco, where she finds herself enmeshed in another kind of liberation. It's 1980 San Francisco, so it's sexual liberation and gay liberation, and the way in which those two stories kind of feed each other and meet and overlap and are different and are the same. That's essentially what the book's about.
Wow, it sounds awesome. so it's a sort of mystery with some romance and some literary, but it sounds literary style. Would you say it's literary fiction?
Well, I don't know what literary fiction is. If it means did the author take pains, then yes, it is very literary. It took me a long time to write it, and I'm very careful about language as well as about theme and so on. So in that sense, I suppose it's literary. But I mean, my main thing was I wanted to tell a good story, and I wanted it to be the sort of book that I love, which is, I just disappear into a completely different world, and that's what I wanted to do with the book. So, I mean, the reviews at the time all spoke about it being quite a page-turner, but yes, I mean, there are serious themes in there.
All right, so you've done a meditation thing on creativity. You write a lot on creativity, and obviously you care passionately about that. How can authors be creative all the time? How can writers do that?
I think it's very much about realising that the bond that you need to be most concerned about is the bond with the inner self. Where all the time the outer world is trying to pull us, and even that includes things like publishing and getting your stuff up on Kindle, but it also includes things like doing research and getting pulled into then again our daily lives and so on. We need practices that cocoon us. The place that the creation comes from is very childlike, very open, very vulnerable, and needs to be protected. If you want to be creative continuously and more creative, if you want to, it's a relationship that can be developed. You can go from being, less creative to being more creative. There's no such thing as not creative. To be human is to be creating. We just may not be aware of it. Sometimes we're creating from a very conscious place. Sometimes it's more unconscious. But the process that creates a book is the same process that creates money, it's the same process that creates a marriage, it's the same process that creates absolutely everything. It's a 7-stage process. But essentially, the key to more creativity is to understand what you need in order to feel connected, very deeply connected to your inner life. And that meditation is one way to do that. It's a very effective way. It is probably the way that it needs the least amount of time given over to it. And it's about really being aware of the fact that everything also has nothing underneath it. And that we notice the things very easily, but we don't really have a way of accessing the nothing. We're not creatively educated well at all. The education system grew up with the Industrial Revolution, and schools became little factories of learning, and now we've left the industrial age, we went into the information age, which kept very much that sort of rigid, conventional learning structure, but now we're moving into the creative age. And not only writers, everybody needs to understand how to access their own creative potential, and we're very poorly educated in that. And so, that's another one of the great things about the interweb, is that you can actually access that sort of education now outside of the conventional education system.
You've come out of traditional publishing where somebody else did marketing, I suppose, for you, and now you're in this indie space. So what are you learning about marketing, and how are you doing this stuff in the new indie world?
Yeah, I wish I could say I had a marketing plan. I am working on putting together a marketing plan, but so far I haven't actually really done any more than trying to understand. One of the first things I started to do was blog. I just started a blog because I worked in journalism for 20 years before I started to write fiction. While writing fiction definitely does develop your voice, it's extraordinary how as a journalist you learn to self-censor. You don't even realise how much you're writing to please an editor or please the reader or please somebody else. And so I started the blog to find my own voice, because I wanted to write about creativity and I wanted to write about the creative process, and what I was finding written about it is very much innovation, business-based stuff, and I was looking at something different, not that. So the first thing I did was blogging, and I started to blog for a variety of reasons. I actually started on the day that I launched my second book, and that's 3 years ago now, and I have to say it is the most revolutionary thing I've done in my writing career by far, in the sense that it reached out and readers who got me arrived to me, and that was just so nurturing and so positive and just so brilliant in so many ways. I can't even begin to explain it, because writing is lonely. It's a cliche, but it is. You're in a room on your own and you don't know if anybody cares or gets it, or and sometimes they get it in quite a different way, but that's a fantastic conversation as well. So blogging has been sort of at the heart of what I do, and I have done the Facebook and a few other those kind of social media things. I love Twitter. That's my favourite, and so I suppose I've concentrated up to now on social media and sort of reaching out a bit through that. I worked, as I said, in journalism, and I did have a marketing and publicity person when I launched the book, but I have to say that most of the coverage that I got for both of my books, I actually got it. So while I had the services, and it was fantastic to be able to say, hi, I have an idea for an article, can you approach the editor so-and-so and sell it? And they were perhaps more likely to take it coming from my publicist, but perhaps not. Very often it was the idea that sold it. And so I think probably what I do have now is an idea of how to approach the press and to try and get them in, and I will begin that process now as I take the book out. I'm giving it a 3-month launch period. I'm going to begin very slowly, and this is another thing that I love about indie publishing. You're in charge. The book, as I said, Joe goes off to San Francisco. San Francisco is one of my favourite places on earth, so I'm going to launch the book in San Francisco. No one can stop me.
Why not?
Absolutely. I'm going to launch it here in the UK and in Dublin again, give it another go there, even though it was launched there originally. And I'm also going to launch it out in San Francisco. And already I have readers there who are beginning to read it, and that's just fantastic. And then I have a number of other kind of speaking engagements lined up for early next year. So I'm hoping that over that 3-month period between blogging and sort of real on-life events, that I will be able to get the book into a lot of hands. And then, well, really it's up to the reader, isn't it? Either people will enjoy it and begin to talk about it, and I'll be back writing the next one.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel that the launch process is a bit false almost these days, because it's more a discovery process. And, you know, I found that my sales went up a couple of months later because, you know, word of mouth and that type of thing. So you can start the ball rolling, but it has to carry on.
Absolutely.
On its own.
Absolutely. And this is one of the reasons that I think the internet and e-publishing is much more significant than even publishers have really begun to grasp. One of the 3 big reasons it's so significant is the long tail, the fact that a book never goes out of print. So if in 3 years' time, 5 years' time, 10 years' time, I want to give After the Rising another little day out, I can. And that just didn't happen before. It was all or nothing. You just got your chance, and when it was over, and it was on to the next book. And I mean, that's fine if you're writing a book that can be produced very quickly. My first book took 10 years. Between writing, editing, publishing, finding publisher, everything else. It was 10 years from starting it to seeing it in my hand. Well, I mean, you know, you need more than 2 weeks.
I can't wait that long.
Well, I wouldn't advise anybody to wait that long. I had a few other things on the go at the time, like a full-time job and 2 children, and, you know, that was part of why it took so long. But, you know, it's ridiculous to think that you can reach the people who want to read your book in 2 weeks. You can't, no matter what sort of machine. I mean, you can, but it's a lottery. I used to call it the literary lottery. And it was easier to win the real lottery than to win the literary lottery.
Yeah.
Okay.
So where can people find you and your books?
Online at Amazon. The Orna Ross page has them all, and there will be more coming on stream early in 2012. And there's a website there, ornaross.com, if you want to know more.
And on Twitter?
Oh, Twitter, Orna Ross. Just Orna Ross, Orna Ross, Orna Ross. Wherever you go.
Thanks ever so much for your time, Orna. That was great.
Thank you, Joe.